I think they're incredibly important to preserve because there's not a lot of women's work that has been preserved to begin with. And so they really represent women and what women were doing and what was important to them. But that's only one part of it. I think what's really important is that quilting represents really all different aspects of life and history.
Welcome to the Quilt Scouts podcast. I'm Megan, your Quilt Scout leader and fellow adventurous quilter. This is a cozy campfire chat for quilters who crave creativity, community, and a gentle nudge to try something new. Each week, we'll talk about quilting and the small adventures that help us grow more confident, one stitch at a time. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get into it. Today's episode is a total bucket list moment because I'm sitting down with Carolyn Ducey from the International Quilt Museum in Lincoln, Nebraska. And this museum is the real deal. Carolyn spent 27 years caring for and growing the museum's collection, and she's basically a quilt detective with a PhD and a headlamp. We talk about what it actually takes to preserve quilts on an institutional level, what first-time visitors can expect when they walk through the doors, and why quilts matter so much as living documents of history, not just the US, but around the world. We also dig into some really fun, practical stuff, like how to protect your quilts at home, why light is sneaky and rude, and what to put on a quilt label so your future great-great-grandkids aren't left playing Guess Who Made This. Plus, if you can't make it to Nebraska anytime soon, Carolyn shares how you can explore the museum virtually, including online collection searches and virtual exhibition tours. And if you're a Quilt Scout, this episode pairs perfectly with the International Quilt Museum badge, and it will definitely light a fire under your brand new Quilt Historian badge, too. Okay, grab your snack of choice, fluff your favorite quilt, and let's head to Nebraska. Here's my conversation with Carolyn Ducey from the International Quilt Museum. Hi, Carolyn. Welcome to the Quilt Scouts podcast. How are you?
Good morning. Thanks. I'm great. I'm happy to be invited. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Carolyn, can you start by telling us a little about your role at the International Quilt Museum and what the museum's core mission is?
Well, my role actually has changed very much in the last year because I retired actually about exactly a year ago. But for 27 years, I was the curator of collections, and then I became the Artist B. James curator of collection in the last few years. I was at the museum, which was just an incredible honor to represent one of our donors, Artist James, and she was hugely influential in building our collection. It was just a fabulous career. I got to oversee new acquisitions that came into the collection and also overseeing the collections team, which takes care of the quilts. And we have some pretty defined rules and regulations that we use when we determine how often we show our quilts, how often we refold them. As you know, quilts have to be refolded regularly, all of those different things. But the mission of the museum is really to build a global audience that appreciates and enjoys quilts in all their different iterations. So we are an international museum, and we represent more than, I think at the last count, more than 64 different countries in the museum.
That's amazing. That's so impressive. So what does a typical day look like for you?
Well, typically I'd come in the morning, check email. We get donation offers almost every day, so I would look at the donation offers that came in. That's always been a wonderful thing and a difficult thing because we are very, very careful to not duplicate too many styles of particular quilts. And being in the Midwest, what we see are a lot of like double wedding rings, grandmother's flower garden. So we try really hard to keep a very balanced collection without too much repetition. And then, of course, we're always looking for quilts that have a known provenance, something that, so we know who made it, when it was made, where it was made. If we have that kind of information, those quilts become a benchmark for the rest of the collection. Because as you know, we don't get that information on many, many of the quilts that we have. So I'd take a look at donations, go down to collections, see what's up down there. We have 60 volunteers or so that come in, some on a weekly basis, some on a monthly basis. They're going to be downstairs in our collections workroom, and typically they're going to be doing things like refolding, and we use a colored sticky note on the boxes so volunteers can go in and kind of just see what needs to be done, take the boxes off the shelf, bring them into the collections workroom, refold them, and put them back on the shelf, which is why we use mostly folded storage, because handling is a big issue for us. We also do have flat storage and we have rolled storage. So it just depends on what method we feel is best for that particular quilt. Then I'd probably spend a lot of time doing research because I also did a lot of the background work for exhibitions. We do about 16 major exhibitions a year. So that's a lot of time. And my colleagues depend on me getting my labels written on time, and that's actually what the other what I'm going to be doing today is trying to wrap up some label writing for our big 250 anniversary show. But every the thing that I liked about my job so much was that every day was different, and you just never know. But for some reason on Monday mornings, sometimes we would get the most amazing donation offers where people would find something, decide what they were going to do, and then Monday morning give us a call or an email. And it'd be kind of amazing to see what people would offer us.
Wow. Is most of the collection in the museum from donations?
Probably a majority, yes. But we also do have an acquisition fund and we do buy quilts. But I would say on the traditional side of things, the bulk of those have come in through donation. Of course, we had our original donation was about 1,000 quilts from Robert and artist James. And that's what started us off back in 1997. And since then, we added, for example, the Joanna Rose collection of red and white quilts. That was 600 white quilts. So when quilts come in big numbers like that, they tend to be donations.
Do you know offhand how many quilts you have in the museum? I'm curious.
It does change all the time, but I would say about 9,000 right now.
Woo! That's a lot of folding.
Yeah, it's a big. We believe we're the largest publicly owned collection that focuses on quilts. And then we probably have a couple thousand more objects that relate to, patterns, materials, tools, all kinds of the things that go with that.
Like quilting adjacent objects.
Yes.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yes.
Wow, that's really impressive. I haven't been to the museum yet, and we're actually supposed to be passing through soon because we're taking a road trip. And we're going to be going through Omaha. I was like, I really want to stop at Lincoln, but I know we're on like a tight schedule, so I might be stopping by. So I'll see if I see you when I'm there.
If you're driving I-80, you're going to go right past Lincoln, so it'd be a very quick lunch stop.
Okay, so how much time would you say that I need to budget for the museum?
I would say a couple hours, though.
Okay.
Some people come and they come all day. Some people come for multiple days. It just kind of depends on how much time you want to spend on each of the exhibitions.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, what do we have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We have probably 6 exhibitions up at a time. And then we have like our third floor hallway. We do a little show up there. We do, we put quilts up on every wall that will hold a quilt.
Anywhere and everywhere you can display a quilt, right? Well,
Yes.
Especially when you have 9,000 that you're trying to probably rotate through and show. Oh my gosh.
People expect to see them when they come, and they're going to see about 100 quilts in a visit.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's a good bit. That's a good bit of time that you'd have to budget, like I said, to make sure you're seeing at least 100 quilts. And then make sure you're coming back for repeat visits so you can see a different collection the next time you're there.
They change constantly.
What do you think people misunderstand about museums, especially quilt museums?
Well, the reaction I get, for example, if I tell people where I work, they say, "Oh, do you make quilts? Are you making quilts?" And I do so, but I'm not a quilt maker and I'm not making quilts for the collection. So I do think people tend to think of us kind of like you'd see an exhibition, say at the state fair, where we just put up a lot of quilts and we hang them up. But our exhibitions are always really researched in depth. They have a very specific big idea or theme that we're looking at. So I think people see quilts presented in a different way. But I also think that because we have an international collection, probably the biggest thing that we hear from people is that they just had no idea what quilts were really all about, because quilts have been around forever. And of course they were made internationally. And that was something that even when I started back in the late 90s, we didn't really know much about what was happening around the world. But quilting has an incredible history of being used all over. And so I think it really kind of blows people's mind when they expect a quilt like the one behind me, and then they see something like right now we have a Japanese Boro exhibition, which is just stunning, and it's patchwork, maybe not quilting. And that was the thing that I had to really learn is when you travel internationally and you ask people about quilts, they don't necessarily respond to the word quilt, but they will definitely respond to patchwork. They recognize that.
That's
and in a lot of
interesting.
cases, it's a variation. Some people do quilts or quilting, so they're going through the layers. Some people don't. Some people just do applique or patchwork. I think people are just blown away by what we have found that has been done all over the world and way before quilts were being made in the US.
Yeah. I can imagine how much variety there is, like you said, and the quilts that have come from other parts of the world, different styles, different colors, probably different materials, like probably just not quilting
Yes.
cotton like we would imagine, you know. Oh, that would
Yeah.
be fascinating to see. Why are quilts so important to preserve, especially on an institutional level?
I think they're incredibly important to preserve because there's not a lot of women's work that has been preserved to begin with. And so they really represent women and what women were doing and what was important to them. But that's only one part of it. I think what's really important is that quilting represents really all different aspects of life and history. So, for example, I could tailor a talk I was doing to a businessman's group, and I would talk about quilting as big business. Historically, the desire to print cotton fabrics drove the economy of the world. I like to say the introduction of cotton into the European market changed the world like the computer has changed our world because
Really?
it was so pervasive and it was so impactful. Because before cotton, which came from India, China, the kind of the eastern area of the world where they knew how to dye it because cotton is not easy to dye. So they were master dyers. In Europe, we were still mostly silk and wool. And, you and I, as probably middle-class individuals, would have just been wearing a lot of wool. And of course, there's so many variations. There's beautiful fine wool, but we would have been wearing probably some scratchy wool. Cotton was just not something that really was in our kind of area of the world. So I think that you can look at it that way. You can look at just the stories that the quilts tell. I think it's just got something for everybody, and I think it's a huge part of our history. It's become such an icon of the U.S. history. So it's become something that we associate with our kind of the idea of Americans as being self-made and thriftful and making things to be used. But there's also all these myths that follow that as well. But I think it's just because quilting has such a role in our world in ways that people don't really understand. But I also
Yeah.
think there's something about quilts. I often wonder about this. I never came up with the real answer in my career, but I think it's something to do with the fact that you can wrap yourself up in a quilt, that quilts are often made for you as a gift to mark specific events in your life. They're just really important. So I think that they are just a huge part of our history and our
Yeah.
future and present. So I think they're really important to have
Yeah.
at a museum.
I can totally see that. One, yeah, usually they're personalized for an individual. Like you said, you're a recipient of a quilt. They're something that's more probably tangible than a lot of gifts. Like you said, comforting, nostalgic. Like there's just so much that goes into a quilt, especially a gifted quilt.
Yes.
Mm.
Yeah. They really are special.
So I have a kind of a follow-up question because you were talking about quilts being such an iconic part of American history. And you had mentioned earlier that there's a 250th anniversary exhibit that you're curating right now. Is that right? What's going into that and when can we expect that at the museum?
Well, as you know, with our 250th anniversary coming up, so many museums are really embracing that. And we are part of a project with Craft in America, which is an organization based in California that does these amazing programs. So if you went to PBS, you could watch all of these different artists in craft mediums, and they do these amazing programs. And they've been supporting us and quilting for years. So we're one of many museums across the U.S. that are doing different types of crafts. So, of course, ours is quilts. So we're doing 250 years worth of history and 250 objects. So we're looking at the history of quilt making. We also have a gallery that's going to be, of course, red, white, and blue, patriotic quilts. But also just our big gallery, our West Gallery, which is the largest gallery we have, will be really how quilts function in people's lives as documents of history, of protest, of making statements. So we're taking over the whole museum. We're using every space in the museum for this show. So it's a really big show that will open staggered starting the first week of June. So every gallery will, one a week, will open throughout June so that we're open for July 4th. And those will be up for the rest of the year.
Okay. I'm really excited about that. You said I'm picturing just classic Americana red, white, and blue quilts, but I mean it's going to be bigger than that, but that's going to be something to see.
We're approaching it more as kind of presenting the history of quilts. So there's a lot more than red, white, and blue, though I will say, for example, we have an amazing quilt made by Luke Haynes, who is an incredible quilt maker. Luke made it out of recycled material that he found at a Goodwill, and it is, I bet it's 100 and I want to say 150 inches at least wide. So it's so big, we've never shown it before. So we're going to put that up in our reception hall, which is an area that's usually we don't hang a lot of quilts in. We are going to do that for this year. So we're going to start with that. And the gallery that shows our red, white, and blue, our patriotic quilts, are going to be all flag quilts, which was an icon that a lot of quilters chose in their quilts and a way that they showed their patriotism. But it's going to be a really interesting show and a really interesting look at our history through that lens.
Well, that'll be fun. Yeah, that'll be really interesting. I was talking to someone else about this recently, and I'm curious to see if there's going to be another kind of surge in new quilters happening, because I know at the 200th anniversary, 1976, there was a big resurgence, right? So I'm curious with it being the
Absolutely.
250th anniversary, if we're going to see something similar happen within the quilting sphere.
I don't see how you couldn't, because it's going to be everywhere. And I was I was young at the bicentennial, but that's what got me started. That's what really piqued my interest.
Really?
Was during the bicentennial, seeing all these quilts out there, and I was like, maybe I could make a quilt. Maybe I could do this. And I made one large size quilt. That's all I ever did. But I did get into the history, and so I think it's going to be great. I think that overall, there's such an interest in DIY right now, knitting, crocheting, everything. I think all of that has had kind of a resurgence anyway. So I think it will definitely be a part of that. And I think it will just bring a lot of people to museums. For example, right now, I was just out, my daughter and grandchildren are out in the DC area. And right now, the Renwick Museum at the Smithsonian has a show called State Fair Quilts. And 3 of the quilts from our collection are in that show, as well as a number of others from Nebraska that were State Fair winners. And just to watch the crowd come in, and of course, they had all kinds of different objects too. Anything you might see at the fair, including a large-scale butter cow. I should say a full size, not a large size, a full-size calf done in butter. It was great. So I think the fact that so many museums will be showing a 250 or something, kind of an adjacent show, I think is amazing. So I think it really will bring awareness. And I think that every time that happens, we see a resurgence. We have the Modern Guild now, which has become such a huge part of quilt history. So I feel like we're in a really good time period where quilt making is on the rise and interest in quilts is on the rise.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I
Yeah.
know the Modern Quilt Guild just had their QuiltCon, and I don't know what the numbers are this year, but I know last year when I went, they said that it was like a record-breaking year with attendees.
Mhm.
So, I
Yeah.
mean, I think you're right. I mean, I think it's just growing and growing, and then I think that everything happening with the 250th anniversary is probably going to be inspiring the next generation of quilters. So it's going to be
Absolutely.
really fun to see.
Absolutely.
Yeah. For someone planning their first visit, what can they expect when they walk through the doors?
Well, when you walk in, first of all, you're going to see the most beautiful building. The Jameses, who are our donors early on, they always gave us funds for supporting acquisitions. They did not want to build a building. They wanted us to see the collection grow, and we grew rapidly with their help. But about 10 years in, Bob said, I think we really do need a building that will showcase the collection. So the James family supported the building of our museum with a gift of half the cost. And at that time, the building was about a $12 million building. So they were hugely influential in that. And so just the building itself is gorgeous. It was designed by Robert A.M. Stern, who is an architect out of New York. And he did this beautiful glass front building that you can't miss as you pull in. So the building was built in 2008. So it's a new building, and it is a gorgeous building. So you'll really be struck by that. Plus, we have a piece of artwork by Rachel Hayes, who is an artist who does quilt related pieces that are meant to be shown outdoors. And typically her pieces go up for a very short time and then come back down. But we, with the donor support, we acquired a piece that she made for the museum. So there's a beautiful triangle of kind of a pieced strip triangle piece that hangs outside the building. And then as you come in, if you take our beautiful art, what did Stern call it? We have a long stairwell that's made with very short stairs, so anyone can walk it.
Okay.
stepped rampway, something like that is what he called it. But all
Okay.
the way up that, we have other pieces by Rachel that are really bright and colorful, and the sun comes through them and makes these beautiful patterns on the walls, on the floor. So first you're going to see a lot of color, a lot of beautiful color, and you're going to enter through our gift shop, which is just amazing, and it's kind of hard to get past because we have so many beautiful things in the gift shop. But what I think is amazing to people is that the building is quite large and it's devoted to quilts. And people just love that. And a lot of people come and they say, this is my bucket list. I've been here forever. So people are really excited to be there. If you came on a weekend, you might, as you go up to our reception hall, you might see the Quilts of Valor sewers who are there and working on quilts. Or there might be other groups that use our space to sew during the weekends. So there's a lot of activity. But what you'll notice as you go up, other than the reception hall, which typically we don't hang a lot of quilts in because it's also a rental space. So we've had weddings in the building. It has to be very flexible, but you'll just see quilts on every wall. You'll see quilts all over and a lot of people coming and going. It's just a really beautiful space. And I'm really struck by that. Still, it's, opened in 2008. And every day you'd walk in and be like, this is just the most amazing building itself.
It sounds like a museum with a lot of life to it, I guess is what I'm picturing. It's not like a stagnant museum with like art on the walls, right? Like there's people sewing, there's events happening. I mean, there's the garden outside. You're painting a really beautiful picture of this museum. I'm really excited to go see it.
And we have we have open windows so you can see into the collections room. So typically in the mornings, maybe not every afternoon, but there's typically volunteers in refolding or putting sleeves on quilts for hanging or maybe doing an object review, which is what we do when we're looking at quilts for exhibition. We want to see what kind of condition they're. So there's a lot of activity going on in there. So we try to make it something very accessible for people and something that they're really going to enjoy. And then it's really cool because light is a textile's enemy. When you go into the galleries, you go through these doors. If you come up the reception hall, you'll see Rachel's piece. You'll see a few pieces, but then you open these doors to the gallery, and that's when you'll really see the exhibitions. And we have an amazing exhibitions team who do amazing designs. Like right now, the Boro quilts, that exhibition doesn't have a single piece hanging on the wall. They're all in the middle of the space so you can see front and back. So every exhibition is different and you're going to see amazing, amazing quilts.
Oh, that's cool. So you can get a 360-degree view of the quilts.
Yes.
I gotcha. Okay. That's neat. So you get to see like some behind the scenes. Like you said, if the windows are open, you're able to see the volunteers working kind of behind the scenes.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think people are intrigued by that because we take such special care of our collection. And it really is the same thing that you want to do at home. If you have an heirloom quilt at home that you want to take care of, it's the same kind of process. But with 9,000 quilts, you can imagine just to keep them refolded on a regular basis is just a constant thing we're doing is refolding. And just people are surprised.
So what would you suggest for someone at home who's trying to preserve an heirloom quilt or any quilt for that matter?
Well, and really, it's not just your quilts, it's your fabric stash too that we want people to be thinking about because, I love going to visit people's studios and they'll have their fabric arranged on these beautiful shelves by color, and it's gorgeous. But you also have to be very careful because any light that's coming in is affecting those textiles or that fabric. So you may pull that fabric off the shelf to use it and have a stripe of fading right down the middle of it. Well, obviously you don't want that. And you especially don't want it on a finished piece because obviously you've put a lot of time and energy in that. So you really have to be aware of light and light levels. Even just what we oftentimes would see would be a tiny little sliver of fading where somebody maybe put the quilt out on a bed in a spare room, which is a great way to store it, but they didn't realize the curtain was letting a little sliver of light through and that affected the quilt. And it happens pretty quickly.
Yeah.
So you want to be aware of that. And so if you're displaying something, it has to be in a pretty low light level situation. For example, at the museum, we use a foot candle measurement. So we use 3 to 5 feet, 5-foot candles. And that is literally the amount of light a candle is going to throw off at 3 or 5 feet. So you can imagine how dim our galleries are because if we put the quilts out in regular light over and over again, they're going to deteriorate because cotton is and silk is even more vulnerable. Wool might hold up a little bit better. It doesn't tend to dye the same, but it will still get dried out and affected by light. So you really want to watch where you hang pieces or store them. You also want to think about textiles just have to be cared for regularly. They're like living things, really. If you think about it, it's cotton, it's wool, it's silk. Polyester maybe is not such an issue, but still, you want to be looking at things regularly so that you're not creating creases. One of the things that we see most often in our historic quilts are creases that occur when a piece has been folded the same way over and over again and then stacked up nicely and left for a period of time, because those fold lines will eventually become creases and then they're almost impossible to remove from the quilt. So sometimes we hang up a quilt and you can see right down the middle how it was folded. And we don't iron the quilts, we don't steam the quilts, we don't clean them. If they need work like that, we send that out and we would have a professional do it. But you can't do much once you have creases in your quilt. So refolding regularly. So really storage and how you show the quilts are really important at home.
Okay.
And if it's an heirloom that you want it to last a long time, then you need to get a nice archival box so that there's no weight on it, so that you have a place where it goes. And also your environment, you don't want things in the attic or the basement. You want them on the level you live, because constantly going through temperature and humidity changes going to really dry your quilt out when it gets too dry. If it's too much moisture, you're going to get mold and mildew buildup. So really just thinking about things like that. And even really for many of your quilters who maybe are making newer quilts, do you want to wash your fabric first? Most people will wash their fabric first, but if you're not going to ever wash it, you can keep that fabric and keep that really crisp feel to it, which is, I would do that for some of my small wall hangings. But if it's something that you're going to wash, of course, you want to make sure you pre-wash. But you can even make decisions like that. Because anything you do, even washing, is what we call an irreversible process, meaning that you're starting the destruction of your fabric even with just washing the quilt. So there's a lot of decisions you want to make. And I'm kind of torn by it because I understand like some of the quilts that we have from the 1600s even survived because they weren't washed and they weren't well used. But I also know that, you give a quilt and you want people to enjoy it and to use it. So it's kind of you just have to make a decision what your quilt is for.
What's the purpose of the quilt? Yeah.
What's the purpose?
I just did another episode on that, talking about using quilts to store memories, like taking them out for a picnic or, things like that. It's like, I'm the first to admit, like, there are some quilts that aren't not for that. And there are some quilts that I feel like are, right? So you'd have to decide ahead of time, like, what is the purpose of this quilt? Is this one going to be well loved and drugged around the house and used to build a fort? Or is it going to be, a family heirloom? So there you go.
And it's just a choice to make, and you can have one for this and one for that. But when your mother makes quilts for your children, that maker loves to see them being, like you said, tugged around the house and making forts. And so it's just kind of dependent. But you can also balance that. You can do a little bit of use, put it away, protect it from light for a little while. One of our most famous Nebraska quilters, Mary Gormley, bless her, she was just amazing. A big part of why we have the Quilt Museum in Nebraska. She had quilts that she put up on the wall and she would change it for every season. So every time you went over, you'd see a different quilt. So she really enjoyed her pieces. But she also only put them out for a short period, and then she'd put them away.
Rotate them. Yeah, that's smart.
Yeah.
When it comes to light, exposing your quilt to light, is it just natural light we have to worry about, or natural and artificial light?
It's really any light. Any light.
Okay.
And certain fabrics are going to be more vulnerable. I did a little test one time where I made a piece that had 1930s fabrics in it. It had new fabrics in it. The 1930s fabrics held up a lot better than the new fabrics did. But the new fabrics were also really dark, and I had a lot of dark blacks and dark colors, and those really changed, I would say, within one season of being in some fairly bright, not direct light, but bright light.
Mm-hmm.
So it can happen really quickly depending on the fabric and the quality of the dyes and all of those things. Natural light is probably going to be the worst. And if you have direct sunlight on something, it's going to fade super quick. So But, I had a piece that my sister gave me when I graduated from college, which I took kind of a long and torturous route. I wanted to see that every day. That meant so much to me. So I did have it out for a while. But then one day I looked at the back of it and saw how different it looked from the side that was exposed to light. And I did put it away after
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Time to protect it. Yeah. I like the idea of the archival box too. So it's not, like you said, underweight. It's protected by a box. That's really smart. I've never even thought about that with storing quilts.
Yeah, and that's what we use at the museum is we use box storage for most of our quilts, and you can buy them through archival companies. They actually sell kits that will have a little tissue in it and the kind of thing, maybe even something to keep it moisture out of the box. It's not cheap, but again, if it's a quilt you want to preserve, like you said, it's really important to not just have it in a stack because the weight is going to
Yeah.
make those creases and fold marks even
Yeah.
worse.
What's currently on display right now that you're especially excited about?
There's a lot of other exhibition. We have the work right now of Karen McTavish at the exhibition and her McTavishing technique, which I loved learning about. But the Boro show is our biggest show. But the galleries change like every 2 or 3 months. There's a new show that comes up. So there's always something fabulous to see.
So not everyone can hop on a plane and visit. So what are the ways that someone can experience the museum virtually?
We put our entire collection online. So it won't happen right away because we have to wait till we get a photo and the quilt goes through a series of steps when it gets accessioned. But generally within 6 months, 8 months, everything will go up online. So we have 6,000 some quilts online. And you can go into that searchable database under collections on our website, and then it'll say search or explore. And there's all kinds of drop-down menus. You can explore by pattern name. You can put a maker's name in. You can put a date in. You can use the keyword to look at wool quilts or silk quilts. So you can see everything. And then when you hover over the image, it will zoom in for you so you can really get a close-up look. And then we also put all of our exhibitions online, which is the cool thing. We use a program called Matterport. And I don't know anything how we do it except that we film it with a special camera. And that way, when you go to the exhibition space and you enter that, it's like you're walking through the gallery. And you can click on there's little circles you click on the label, it pulls it right up.
Okay.
Quilt, it'll pull it up, you can zoom in. So because we know a lot of people aren't going to make it to Nebraska, we want our exhibitions to be available to anybody. And it takes a minute to kind of figure out how to move through the space, but it's not difficult. And you can walk right through and see everything and experience it as if you were at the museum. So
That's
that's also
really cool. That's really cool. I didn't know that you had that option on the website. I'm just picturing like, a virtual house tour or whatever, like when you're
Yeah,
shopping for a house, the
exactly.
same thing, right? Yeah, you can
Exactly.
click through. Oh, that's super cool.
Yeah, the other thing I'd add is that we do have a YouTube channel. So when we have people come to visit or we do our textile talks, which we do along with 3 other organizations, there's a textile talk every Wednesday. Those are all are archived at our YouTube site. So you can, if you want to learn more about quilt history, there are so many lectures and things that you can listen to there. We work with Surface Design, Studio Art Quilt Associates, the Quilt Alliance, and the Quilt Museum. And so we each take a turn. So we do a program about every 5 weeks, and it's free. And they're supporters, of course, and you'll see those sponsors' names come by. But if you sign up, your name's not confused for anything else. You can sign up and say, yes, I want to get a notice about the next one. But we started that in 2020 when COVID hit, and it's been so popular that we still keep doing it.
Just kept it going.
Sometimes there's as many as 500 people live from all over the world. And so it's kind of amazing to see that those textiles just connect people like that. It's really cool.
That's very cool. So you have a live version if you want to attend real time
Yes.
virtually, or you can go back and watch the old lectures that are archived.
Yes.
Okay. That's really good to know. Are there any educational resources for people who want to go deeper that you would recommend?
There are, and I'm so glad you mentioned that. On our website, if you go in, there's a little globe at the top, and we're actually promoting it more. We have a program called World Quilts, and it is my colleague Maren Hansen's kind of baby. And we created it many, many years ago because we would get so many questions about quilt history. And usually it was like middle schoolers. Can you tell me the history of quilts? Well, not really. But we realized there was a real need for a history that was based on a very basic level, but that you could just keep digging deeper and deeper. So the World Quilt site now has, I think, 6 different components. So it'll have the American story, it has the Amish story, it has the Jameses story, so you can learn more about our donors, the 1930s story. But when you go into the first page, you can just read what's there, and it's going to give you kind of a brief overview. And it's written for middle school age kids so they can use it. But there's also all of these links, so you can just keep digging deeper and deeper. And a lot of the links are articles from other museums or other scholars, not just us, but just a way to really go deep with that history if you like. And it is a great site. Plus, you'll see some beautiful quilts, some from other collections if we didn't have one that fit. And it's constantly being added to, so it's growing all the time. But it's a great resource for people to use, especially if they just want to get more history. I also suggest that going in and just doing a search on the database, like if there's a time period you really wanted to look at, if you did a search, say under colonial revival or 1930s, it's going to bring up all the quilts in the database, the individual quilts, but it's also going to bring up any exhibitions that go with that topic. And that's where you'll get a lot of in-depth history on that topic, is through our exhibitions.
Okay.
So using just the overall search capability on the website is a great way to kind of dig into those two, because the database of quilts is going to show you a photo and give you some very basic information, but not going to delve into that style or that history.
I see. Okay, that makes sense.
You can get lost on our website.
I was going to say, if you're
There's so
looking
much
for a
there.
rabbit hole to go down, this is a good one.
Yeah, and the other thing I will throw out there for people, you can sign up for our Quilt of the Month, which is kind of a newsletter we do once a month. Again, we don't use it for anything else. It's free. And then you're going to get announcements. You're going to see what's coming up, exhibitions coming up, opportunities to see people speaking here. All of those things will come to you. Or you can just look at the beautiful quilt we feature each month.
So that's the monthly newsletter.
Yeah.
And how do people sign up for the newsletter?
And just search for Quilt of the Month.
Okay.
When you go into the website, and there's a page there that'll ask you for whatever information. I think it's just name and email. But it's always fun. Oftentimes, the Quilt of the Month will be a new acquisition, or it will be a featured quilt from one of the upcoming shows. So it's a good way to keep track. And you definitely want to see what's on the calendar. Maybe that'll be the year you decide it's worth a trip to Nebraska to see that incredible show that's coming up. So
I don't know if you know this or not, but for Quilt Scouts, we actually have an International Quilt Museum badge. So when a scout goes to visit the museum in person, that's a badge that they can earn. Yeah. So for any Quilt Scouts that are going to make the trip to experience the museum in person, are there any particular galleries or collections that you would recommend that scouts linger in?
Well, they're going to see something different all the time. I mean, we can't put up quilts permanently. And that's why you'll never see the same thing when you go there. There's always different galleries. So the building opened in 2008. Within 2 years, Robert James came to us and said, "You don't have enough space. We especially don't have enough storage. We need to expand." And honestly, when he said that, I about cried, because that means construction and dust and all these issues that we had just gotten through with the building of the building. We'd just gotten settled in, but we were so lucky the university just couldn't raise more money. So the James family paid for an expansion that doubled our exhibition space and our storage space. And Bob was right. We are well past filling up our first storage space.
Wow.
So to build the West Gallery, there's a walkway, we call it the bridge. And sometimes people go up and they see the first 3 galleries and they don't realize there's a bridge to go through, because we're so aware of our conservation that the lights go out if there's not any motion. So you look down this hall and you just see a dark space. So don't miss the West Gallery, because that's where our biggest shows are and we can really delve into a topic. But I would just say, look into what is going up. We have a great exhibitions page, what's coming up, and make sure, you know what you're to look for, or keep up with that so you know if there's a topic that you're really interested in, you can explore it. Because not only do our curators do a great job of researching, but we bring in guest curators who really are experts in their field. So the thing you can count on with our quilts is really solid research. And we don't say anything unless we know it. So you'll see on our labels things like, oh, probably made here, possibly made at this time. We try to be really careful, as our first director used to say, how do you know what you know? Because there were so many quilt myths out there. Even when I started in 97, we just didn't really know what quilting was all about. We really have learned a lot over the last few decades. So we're very careful with things like that. But um, there is just so much to see and so many quilts that you'll appreciate. And I would say just take your time, read the labels. When quilts are so large and they're on the wall, it's really easy to see them and kind of go past to the next one. But if you really look closely, they're just amazing. And especially quilts that have been around for a long time, that have survived throughout time and history. They're rare and they're unusual, and that's what gets me. I love the historical. I love the new quilts as well, and I kind of learned to do both as curator at the really, really early quilts. Just amaze me because they've survived. Our earliest quilts are silk quilts, which you think would never survive, but they're really in pretty good shape from the 1600s.
I was going to ask, what is the oldest quilt that you have in the museum? 1600s?
You know, those dates, sometimes you'll see a range of maybe 50 years. It's hard to pinpoint. But yes, we have quilts from the 1600s. Our earliest quilts were in an exhibition called Old World Quilts. So you could go in and you could see our earliest there in that exhibition and walk through and see those. And then you can also get really up close and see the detail in them. And I think you just need to, maybe see some quilts, take a break, let them soak in, go back to the next gallery. There's a lot. I mean, when you think of 100 quilts, that's a lot to see.
That is a lot. So pro tip, don't miss the West Gallery. Make sure you visit that one. And then slow down and read the labels, read the descriptions, and take in that information, the historical tidbits, the bits you're going to learn about the quilt more than just seeing it.
And I know, when you go to a museum, it's hard to take in all of that. So if you do see a quilt that you really liked, each quilt has an object number. It's going to start with the year it came into the collection. So it'll be, for example, one of my favorites is 2004.004.0004. If you write that number down, you can go into the database and you can see it. You can see what exhibitions it's been in. You could read about it. So you can always do more research later, because sometimes you're with a group and they want to keep moving along. Or you can go back to the exhibition and relook at it when you get home. I like to go in and kind of look around and just see what really draws my eye, what really fascinates me, and then really explore those in depth.
Do you allow photography in the museum if someone wants to take a picture of a quilt? Okay, I'm just curious.
Yeah, as long as there's no flash, you can take photos and also do that and then go home and enjoy them later too.
Right? It's like, take a picture. It'll last longer that way. Isn't that what the saying?
Yes, yes.
Enjoy it more at home. So one of our newest badges we have is called the Quilt Historian Badge, and specifically to encourage Quilt Scouts to explore the history of quilting, maybe research a historic quilt block or research a family heirloom quilt that they have in their possession, things like that. So for our brand new Quilt Historian Badge, for someone just beginning to explore quilt history, where would you suggest they start?
I would start with our website. Do a search by that pattern name, because if you do a search over the general website, not just on the search page, like say you wanted to look at 1930s quilts. If you put in a 1930s quilt or pattern name from that era and search that, you're going to get all those exhibitions. And that's where you're going to really find our history. That and the World Quilt site. World Quilt is where most of our history is at. But I think that, for example, when I did my PhD, I did it through the quilt program. One of the ways you learn about a particular type of quilt is by going online and always looking for other examples and trying to find examples that have a family name or a maker. For us, if a quilt has a known family maker and a date, then we know that's when that quilt was made. We know that's typical of that period, and that's really going to give you information. And so often quilts come to us and people think, oh, I think it was made about this time. But once you start really learning, you can actually date a quilt within maybe a 20-year range by looking at the fabric, the pattern, the size. You can really hone your eye so that you'll recognize quilts from the time period you're interested in, or you can learn about the pattern. Patterns are a little bit more difficult to learn if you're trying to get a history of a pattern name, because they're different in every area that people use those names. So, strangely, pattern names aren't really a great way to do a lot of in-depth history because we don't know. We know after the 20th century, so 1900 is when we first see printed patterns coming
Yeah.
out. Prior to that, it was just people sharing, like you'd go to the fair and you'd see a quilt you like, or your neighbor would show you something, or your sister-in-law might send a little drawing, or, there just weren't printed sources to
Hmm.
get patterns. So just doing a lot of comparison of quilts that have solid information with them is going to tell you, like I said, they're the benchmarks, and because you know how quilts are. Sometimes you start a quilt and you don't finish it for 20 years or you don't go back to it forever. So when was it really made? What
When was it
typical era is
actually?
it?
Yeah, that's so true.
Depending on somebody who dated their quilts. And you have to always be careful because a date on a quilt could be a birth date. It could be,
Oh,
some other marriage. You always have to think about, like, okay, this says 1930s on it, but is it really typical of that time period? Do the fabrics fit that? And so that's how we assign dates. And you'll notice on our labels, we use ranges all the time because we know so oftentimes people don't start a project and go straight through and finish it.
hmm.
They go back and forth maybe. So we try to be really careful to assign dates to things if we don't know that for sure, because that is what somebody can look at it. And I will say that's one of the things that we're the most proud of is that our site is really carefully researched. And if we don't know, we make it very obvious in our labels that we don't know. And I think most museums do that now
Yeah.
too. We just know that there's a lot of those different situations that can occur.
I would have never considered that. I'm just thinking about the quilts that I've personally labeled. Yeah, the baby quilts where I put the date of birth and not when I made it. I didn't even think of that, but that's so true. That can be really confusing, 50 years from now, trying to piece these, puzzle pieces together. But you're like a quilt detective. You're having to gather
Exactly.
all these clues.
And I will say that I'll get on my soapbox for a minute because most important thing to do is to label your quilt. And here's my new thing is that I always said put a label on the quilt. And actually we, when we had quilt ID days for a long time, we would create a label and we would baste it to the back of the quilt, actually sew it to the quilt with big stitches so that it would never get separated because people are like, well, I had a piece of paper with it. Now I can't find the piece of paper.
Hmm.
But I think too that makers today should put their name on the front of the quilt like an artist does with a painting. Why put it on the back? Why not be proud of your quilt? Put it on the front, then put a label on the back that says all that who, what, where, when, and
Hmm.
why. The why is the question we can never answer. We might know, okay, this was made for so and so's baby. There's questions like that you can answer through your research. But if sometimes you see the most beautiful quilts and you just want that quilter to talk to you.
You want the story.
And so your label needs to be like, what do you want to share with that person? Because think about the quilts that are saved, nobody thought, oh, this is going to end up in a museum someday.
Never,
But it
no.
did. Those are the things that we look for the collection because the unknown ones, there's a lot of them out there. And
Hmm.
like I said, we can get pretty close to an identification once you look at a lot of quilts and you see the typical patterns and the typical colors of an era. And honestly, women followed fashion. Women have always followed fashion. That's the ironic thing. Even in the 1600s, people knew what was desirable and what was the cool thing to have, and they tried to find it for themselves if they had enough money to. So there are trends and there's fashions you can get to know and you'll recognize them. And then the cool thing too is we have a team, the genealogical task force. And so when a quilt comes into our collection with a maker, we can actually do some research. And sometimes all you can get out of your research is a census record that says, yes, she lived at this time and we know this is the right place. You can confirm information, but sometimes you get lucky and they're in like a newspaper article. And it might even be that she made this great quilt and what it was all about, or a church group made a quilt and what was. So sometimes you get really lucky and you can find amazing history and it really makes those quilts come alive. And if you don't have a name, you're never going to be able to learn.
Yeah.
It's always going to be a mystery.
So for quilters making quilts today, and we want to benefit the museum 100 years from now, what do you want to see on a quilt label? I'm curious.
Well, like I said, I say sign the front. And
Okay,
you
sign the
can
front.
use an archival pen. You can just use it with a pen. There's some great Pigma pens that we use at the museum when we put our numbers. We put our numbers on a little piece of twill tape, and then we sew that to the quilt. And that's how we keep track of everything, is its object number. So I want to see who, what, where, when, and then why'd you make this quilt? Is there anything special? Why did you use that color? Why did you change that pattern? Sometimes you'll look at a quilt and you'll be like, something is like one block is different. Was that on purpose? You want those little details about it. So on the back, your label could be quite extensive. And again, if you take a piece of muslin and you stretch it, then you can and then you can write on it pretty easily. In the older years, when they signed quilts in the 1840s, they actually would starch their fabric. Now we don't recommend that because we don't know how that's going to last over time.
Yeah.
But really, just tell the whole story.
Okay. So I'm picturing like a piece of fabric stretched almost like an embroidery hoop would probably be the best way to do that. Pigma pen, archival pen, write it all out. So the who, what, where, and the why is probably the most important. I would feel like the story behind it. And if there's the more interesting details you can include, the better. So that's the stuff that's going to benefit quilt museum curators the best. Like 100 years, 50 years from now, 100 years from now.
Or even just your family, because we get so many quilts that are offered to us that are family quilts still.
Mm-hmm.
And they say, well, it could be this generation or it could be this person. We don't know. And I'm sure at some point somebody was telling, don't forget, tell people who made this quilt also.
Yeah.
But that information, they say like over 2 generations, people don't even know who their relatives were anymore. So that information gets lost really quickly and easily. So writing it down and then sewing it onto a label and then sewing that label onto the quilt is really the best way to, at least you're trying to keep that information with the quilt. You never know what's going to happen, and we have to kind of let go of things we're not going to be around to know. It's pretty incredible when you can research a woman. In fact, I'm reading a diary of a woman from 1750 in Philadelphia, and we have a quilt in our collection that relates to her family. And this woman wrote a really incredible diary of what was going on in her world. And so to get that understanding and be able to link it to the quilt that we have is so cool.
That's so very cool to tie that, like the context, what was happening in the time, or, oh, that's fascinating. Now, you had mentioned that you have your PhD. What is your PhD in?
So my PhD is in textile history with an emphasis in quilt studies.
Okay.
Yeah.
That explains why you're such a wealth of knowledge on this. I was like, I feel like I could talk to you for days about
I can talk quilts endlessly. I find it so fascinating
Me
and so
too.
interesting. And I did work with quilts for 27 years. So I saw a lot of quilts come in and out and went to a lot of quilt shows. And, so the experience I had was invaluable. There's also so many great collections out, museum books. There are just a list of wonderful books you can get. The Quilt Alliance is one of our partners, and they have a thing called the Quilt Index. And the Quilt Index, they are trying to archive information about as many quilts as they can. So our computer program doesn't work with theirs. So we only have chunks of our collection that we could easily pull out and share with them. But you'll see quilts from our collection there. You'll see quilts from all of the state projects that were done in the 20th century when they logged in quilts from each different state. So there are great sources online for quilt history. And like I said, when I started working on my dissertation, I worked on quilts from the 1840s. And one group was just like, well, these quilts, they had this information that they might have been from the same area and similar families. Can I prove that they were linked or not? Well, when I finally sat down and went through photo by photo, they were chintz appliques. So there are all these different fabrics applique to make like a beautiful basket of flowers. People combine different fabrics in those. But when I started looking, I was like, they all have the same fabrics. They share the fabrics. They share this look. They shared so much. So I was able to say, yes, these are linked by a family member or like cousins. Actually, one woman was an aunt, even though she was about the same age as her nieces. So it's just incredible what you can find. And you just have to be kind of dogged about going to all the sources. There are wonderful books almost every state in the country has done a quilt history project now. So, for example, we did ours in Nebraska, and there's a wonderful book called Nebraska Quilts and Quilt Makers. And it shows some of the highlights, and it talks about who the typical quilt maker was. And they went up to about 1950.
Okay. What's the latest that they had covered? Okay.
Yeah. So there are a lot of those history projects that are out there. Their records are on the Quilt Index now, many of them, including the Nebraska project. And the Nebraska project logged over 5,000 quilts in a couple of years. So
Wow.
there's a lot of great research that's been done and continues to be done by scholars.
Thank
There's
goodness.
I love Linda Baumgarten. She was at Colonial Williamsburg. She curated a number of shows for us. Talk about an amazing scholar. Linda Eaton was at Winterthur, which has an amazing collection. So the big museum collections typically have also done great books on their collections. And so just exploring everything you can about a particular style will really help you learn a lot.
I feel like you could dedicate a lifetime to this. Like, there's just so much to know and learn and understand. And the fact that you're able to piece some of these stories together is so impressive. Like the family connection, to be able to piece that they're making these quilts at the same time using probably shared materials. That's really impressive.
Well, I have to tell you, when I did my research, I kept coming. So I looked at that group, and then I looked at another group that had the quilt itself said it was made for a woman named Anne Reese by the First Baptist Church Sewing Society. And I was like, well, what's all that about? Well, I started doing research and realized there were a number of quilts that the First Baptist Church had made. It was kind of a thing for them. And I started with 4, I think, and I ended up with 7 that I could identify as being made in the 1840s by the First Baptist Church. But I kept coming across this little notation about the woman our quilt was made for, Anne Reese. And it was like some kind of like, I can't even remember how they described it, but it was like a booklet, a family booklet. So it's like, well, I got to track this down. And I finally did have it sent to me. They sent me a whole roll of microfilm to see it. And when I finally got that opened up, it was letters that Anne Reese, who received our quilt, had written to her granddaughter or her daughter. And most of the letters were about Baptist faith. And so it would be little snippets like, oh, we can't come into Philadelphia today because the fever is raging. So we're staying outside of the city to be safe. And then it would be 2 pages of all this, behave or God will smite you. And then at the very end, it'd be like, and I'm sending you some of my your favorite cookies because I know you love them, and some sweet messages. But one of the letters in there was actually written about when Anne Reese was given her quilt. So she was in her 60s, and she had led this women's sewing society for years. And she was getting to the point where she couldn't come to meetings anymore. She was late 60s, early 70s. And so she wrote her daughter this letter about how these people came to her house because she couldn't go to the meeting. They brought a quilt in. She thought they were giving it to the church to sell because they were making money to raise for missionaries. So she was like, oh, how lovely of you to have this in a quilt. And they're like, no, this one is not for sale ever. And she opened it up, and each block was signed by someone who was in that group, and they have this huge inscription in the center. Her grandchildren made blocks, and so it was this beautiful quilt that she received, and so she's writing about how she felt about it and how meaningful it was. So to find a letter like that, and then I found, and because she sent the letters, but her daughter actually had her grandson copy them all into this notebook. So they were all copied and kept that way. So there was a letter where she thanked all the women at the church for making her this quilt and how much it meant to her. And so you just never know. And that letter in that little notebook it's in a collection on the East Coast. I mean, it's always been just sitting there in the archives, and I was able to find something and link it to an actual quilt. It was the coolest thing ever.
That is so cool. I mean, talk about bringing history to life, right? That is really, really cool.
So there, and I think there's just so much information that's still out there. There's a lot of research that could be done and a lot of information to find. But that's why I think it's so important to put labels on things because, maybe
it makes your job easier.
Who were you? What were you doing? What were you up to? You never know.
And you said you're retired now. You're a volunteer at the museum?
I'm still working. I'm retired from my position. I'm still working for the museum doing special projects. So I'm kind of doing a lot like you're doing. I am trying to record the museum's history through interviews because it just disappears so fast. So I am just talking and interviewing and doing tapings of people who knew the museum and why it went back when we started and why it was important for them to be involved and what they see, just anything they want to share. I
Sure.
actually just had a series of interviews I did with Roderick Kirikoff, and he has quilts in our collection. He collected recently. He has a new book that was just reissued called Unconventional and Unexpected. He looked at quilts from the 50s and 60s when people didn't think people were even making quilts, and they were very functional and very fun. And for me, it was incredible to meet him because I read his history books and I knew his name and I knew he was a really famous scholar. And then I got to know him as a friend. But he was involved in quilting back in the 60s when it was first really, this revival was just beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And he could talk about the bicentennial and what it meant. And he could talk about being in California and being a quilt dealer and seeing, just incredible things happening in the quilt world. So I did like 7 or 8 interviews with him because we went through from the 60s all the way up to today.
Yeah.
And it's just what you wish as a historian that somebody had done 100 years ago.
Yeah.
And there's very few of that kind of thing done. So I'm just trying to do that now. So I'm really having fun.
Yeah, it sounds like a fun project. I'm so grateful for you for putting that work in and documenting these things and telling these stories and doing the research. Oh my goodness. Thank goodness for you.
Well, I'm one of many, and it's been, it's just crazy when I look back on it because I knew I wanted to do something with women's work and women's quilting. I was an embroiderer, which is what got me started.
Mm-hmm.
So to be able to have a job that's what I did, and it also took me all over the world to see quilts all over, I was really, really lucky.
So if someone is listening and thinking, I love this, I want to support it, what are some of the ways that they can get involved or support or contribute to the museum?
Well, of course, we have a wonderful membership program, and that is a great way to do it. I mean, we can take donations in all kinds of different ways too, but membership is great because there's different levels you can join at. So if you think you're going to be in Nebraska and you want to come often, you get a membership that includes free entry to the museum every time you come. You can get a family membership so you can bring in other family members. There's probably 4 or 5 different ways that you can become a member, but that's really important. And that membership supports so much of what we do at the museum. So I really appreciate you asking about that. And I think just to go to the website, again, search membership. You'll see it there. If you were coming to Nebraska, there's a great page on how to get here, how to visit. Lincoln is a really safe town. It's a really great place to stay. You're not going to really find places in town that are going to be, it's just a really safe, smaller city. So it's easy to reach. You can reach us through Lincoln. Lincoln has a small airport. It's a little more expensive to come into Lincoln, so you can fly into Omaha, which is a 1-hour drive. And that's where you're going to get your best flights. All that information is going to be on the website. But yeah, supporting us that way is just huge because it's always, I think for any museum that you love, giving them support really helps because it's always hard to have funding and support a museum and keep it running. We're very fortunate that as a part of the University of Nebraska, we have an endowed program. And so we are also really building an endowment. So if people wanted to think about giving a larger gift to make sure the museum stays open forever, that's our goal. And that's why an endowment is so important to us because it gives us that kind of support that you can count on year to year. Economies change so fast, the world changes so much. So having that kind of support is huge. And to keep a museum open is a lot. There's a lot of expenses. Just imagine we have temperature and humidity controls for all of our quilts. Just that alone is a big expense.
Yeah,
So
I can imagine.
membership and money and donations like that really, really are important.
Okay, and I'll make sure to link that in the show notes as well if
Thank
anyone
you.
wants to contribute to the endowment or make a monetary donation.
Yeah.
And you did mention this, but does the museum accept quilt donations, and how does that process work if someone wanted to donate a quilt?
There is a page online that you can go to donate, and it will ask you all the questions that we need to know, that give you some prompts so that we know what kind of information you know about the quilt, and you can submit a photo there. I will say donations have really slowed down because we are very aware of the fact that we don't have endless space. And like I said, we've already filled our first storage and we're into our second storage room. So that made us kind of pause a little bit. But you can always send a request in. And if it's not something for us, we have a list of other quilt organizations that might be interested. The Missouri Star Quilt Museum, I think, is actively acquiring pieces, or last time I checked, they were.
Okay.
A lot of places are like us. Once you have an established space, you can only take so many. So
Yeah.
we're trying to not duplicate a lot of quilts, but we're always surprised and amazed by what's out there. So
Okay. So step one would be if someone wanted to donate a quilt, is to send a request and you guys can essentially review it, see if it would be a good fit for the museum. If not, at the very least, it sounds like you can help maybe find a home for it.
mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, we have a committee, so everything that comes in is going to have to go through that committee that will make the final decision. Our
Okay.
curators can make a recommendation, but they do not make that final decision. And then, yes, there's other museums. They let us know what they're looking for. We let them know if we're looking for anything particular. So we work with a lot of places, so it might be able to help you find a place.
Okay.
I will say it's kind of the dilemma. There's so many quilts being made, and there's not nearly enough quilt museums. We sure wish there were more that were preserving this work. In some cases, I think artwork is meant to just go from the hand of collector to collector. So
Yeah.
this one was just given to me by a friend at the museum. It was owned by a woman named Virginia Welty. Her mom made it, and Jenny was one of our volunteers. And when Cheryl told me she had one of Jenny's quilts, I was like, the last thing I need is another quilt in my personal collection. But I'm so happy to have this one
It's
because I knew
beautiful.
Jenny. It meant a lot to me. So
Yeah, I love that. It's very beautiful. Okay, well, thank you so much for this amazing interview. I feel like I learned a ton. I feel like you are a wealth of information. And like I said before, I think we're going to have a follow-up episode or two to cover some of these other topics we touched on, because I
absolutely.
feel like we could do such a deep dive. Are there any other places where listeners can follow the International Quilt Museum besides the website? Is there social media or anything else that we can link?
Absolutely. We're on all the social medias, Instagram, Facebook, all of those things. Like I said, the Quilt of the Month is a great way to connect if you don't want to be on social sites. Like I said, the YouTube site too. If you wanted to do some really fun listening to lectures and things like that, that's a great source. So you'll find us all over.
Okay. Amazing. Thank you so much, Carolyn. This has been such a blast. I appreciate you taking the time to talk with us.
You can tell I love talking about it. We could be
Me
here all
too.
day.
I know, me too. I was like,
No, I really appreciate you asking.
yeah, absolutely.
it's been fun.
Absolutely. If you enjoyed this episode, I would love for you to follow or subscribe to the Quilt Scouts podcast so you don't miss future episodes. And if you have a minute, leaving a review is one of the best ways to help this podcast find other quilters who could use a little creativity and community too. You can find show notes and more from Quilt Scouts at quiltscouts.com. Until next time, happy Trail Scout.